most of the cases involve a child who reports memories of a past life of somebody who they are not related to. For memories to be passed down through the genes, the child would have to be a direct descendant of the previous person. And also, 3/4 of our kids talk about how they died in the previous life, and obviously genes get passed on before someone is at their death scene. So there's no way those memories could be transferred through their genes. One well-known example here in the U.S., and we've studied 2,500 cases from around the world, but one of the well-known ones in the U.S. is a little boy named James Leininger, who had memories of being a World War II pilot. It's believed that pilot has now been identified. James was born from this Christian couple in Louisiana. His dad in particular was quite opposed to the idea of past lives. But around the time of James's second birthday, he started having horrific nightmares multiple times a week where he'd be kicking his legs up in the air, screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And also during the day, he would repeatedly take his toy airplanes and say, "Airplane crash on fire," and slam it into the family's coffee table. So sometime after his second birthday, his parents were also able to talk with him while he was awake about these memories. And he said how he had been a pilot and that his plane had crashed on fire, that he had been shot down by the Japanese, and he said that he flew a Corsair. Now, this is a 2-year-old, flew a Corsair, which is a type of plane that I'd never heard of, but one that was developed during World War II. And then he said he flew off of a boat, and his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. And his dad then found there had been USS Natoma Bay that was stationed in the Pacific during World War II. He printed out the information, which the printout shows the date he printed it out. So it documents when James was 28 months old. The word Natoma was part of the story. They also asked him who he had been, and he would always say me or James. They also asked him one time who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. He later said that he had been shot down at Iwo Jima, and it turned out that the USS Natoma Bay did, in fact, take part in the Iwo Jima operation. There was only one pilot from the ship that was killed during that operation, which was a 21-year-old young man from Pennsylvania named James Houston. So if James Leininger was remembering a past life, it had to be Houston's life because he was the only pilot on the Natoma Bay who was killed at Iwo Jima. Well, it turns out that Houston, in fact, had flown a Corsair. His plane crashed exactly as James described. He said how his plane was hit in the engine, it burst into flames, crashed in the water, and quickly sank, which is exactly what Houston's plane did. And James had said how Jack Larson was there with him, and Jack Larson was the pilot of the plane next to Houston on the day that he was killed. So this is a case where the father did the research on this, but we've got very good documentation that was made before he was able to identify Houston as a pilot. And details from little James matched perfectly with this World War II pilot who had been killed 60 years before he was born. Houston and his family had absolutely no connection to James's family, and it seems impossible that he could have learned that information through any sort of normal means.
Does that mean that there is a soul spirit memory that absorbs lifetimes and can recycle in a reincarnative cycle, and that humans would remember past lives?
Well, we really can only speculate about exactly what this means. In the narrowest terms, it provides good evidence that some children have memories of a life from the past. So the most obvious explanation is that they're remembering a past life because they experienced that past life, which would imply some kind of continuation. We would certainly be tempted to say a spirit or a soul. I suspect it's probably more complex than we can really understand, but it would be something like that. But there are other explanations possible. One idea that some people have proposed is that the child is connecting with this data bank of memories, but not that the child actually experienced those things himself, even though the child thinks that he did because he has these quote-unquote memories, but that he didn't really have that life. There are other speculative ways of looking at these cases that they don't really prove what the process is, But I do think they provide strong evidence that there can be this connection between lives of an individual continuing from one life to another.
What about the possibility that DNA itself is some kind of a medium in which entire life experiences can be encoded in ways that maybe we haven't understood and so far don't have a way to extract, but the DNA itself can record?
Well, it's certainly an interesting thing to speculate, but our cases would not be consistent with that explanation because the children are not descendants of the previous person or even descendants of anyone who was present when these things were happening. As far as whether genes can carry memories, if it does, for the most part, it has to be on some sort of unconscious kind of level because, as far as we know, most children don't come out reporting memories of their grandparents or their great-grandparents.
Well, let's go back to the idea of the body container in which there is an animating spirit soul. It seems that the work you are doing with children, it links to the out-of-body experiences of people who have been near death. There's a part of them that seems to leave the body container and have extraordinary experiences in some other dimension, and then they come back to describe. So again, it seems this is all reinforcing the concept that there is some sort of a soul spirit that is going in and out of body containers, has some sort of a matrix of its own that can record life experiences and retell them.
Well, that's right. We use slightly different terminology, but yes, there's this idea that consciousness can exist separate from a functioning brain. So in our cases of the children, it appears that this consciousness has continued after someone died, and it somehow becomes associated with a new developing brain and shows up as past life memories. In the case of near-death experiences, yes, people can describe incredible experiences that happen in another realm like heaven. Some of them have also given details of things that happened around them as they were physically at the point of death, as their heart had stopped and the code was underway to try to bring them back. And occasionally they will describe events that happened down the hall or even in another location that proves to be accurate for what was going on. So yes, it does suggest that there was this consciousness that was capable of experiencing new knowledge, of taking in new information while the brain was not functioning.
Is there any reason why we as a human family should not then embrace the concept of a soul spirit as a third part of mind, body, and spirit?
Well, soul and spirit have connotations that are not necessarily supported by this work. The work that we do is not from a religious perspective, but the work does suggest that, as you say, that there's this consciousness piece that can be considered separate from the body and the functioning brain. Beyond that, I think in the bigger picture, I would argue that the physical world, that it actually grows out of consciousness. That as Max Planck, who was the founder of quantum theory, as he said, he viewed consciousness as fundamental. He thought matter was derived from it. I think there's a lot of truth in that, and would mean that we would have no reason to think that consciousness would end when a physical brain dies. But the whole physical world grows out of consciousness, and these pieces of consciousness get attached to the brain but are not necessarily dependent on it.
Well, is there any reason why the soul-spirit concept shouldn't be part of the physics of body, mind, soul, spirit? What is wrong with that?
Well, the main objection, I would say the main mainstream objection, is that everything grows out of the physical. So there is this physical world, and animals develop through evolution, and the brain developing. Consciousness is just sort of a byproduct that happened to occur through certain evolutionary advantages. I think if we're going to use terms like soul and spirit, then we better define them rather carefully. For me, it's enough to just consider there is this consciousness or mind, or if you prefer, spirit piece that is a separate entity from the physical world, and I would say there is good evidence that it can exist after the physical body that it's attached to dies.
Do you suppose the implication is that there is a certain amount of time that a given soul spirit is supposed to be in a given body container? And if that is cut short for reasons, as you said, murder or something else that's not a natural death, that the time inside of a container is important some way, and that could explain why there are some recyclings?
Well, some people have talked about the idea of unfinished business, but it does seem either dying violently or actually dying young. There may well be something to this idea that a life that is cut short that leads the consciousness to continue on in a life here as if the last one didn't fulfill its complete purpose.
It gives hope beyond a planet that seems sometimes to be sinking into nothing but violence.
Exactly.